Fiscal year 21-22 was a year of recoveries and that of urgent fiscal intervention. The range of fiscal interventions varied between the long-term measures and short-term measures, with long-term being represented by the much publicized production-linked incentive schemes spread over almost 14 to 15 sectors with a budget outlay of almost 3 trillion rupees. And on the other hand, we had short-term measures such as the divestment of central public sector enterprises like that of Air India and a few others to follow this year. That said, the growth this year seems to be a greater challenge for the government, and this is in light of the global supply chain disruptions and lack of employment growth rate this year. Government therefore is expected to utilize the time ahead to weed off certain systemic deficiencies in the economy to make sure it does not fall into what is otherwise looking ahead as a rather stagflationary sentiment in the economy. Some of our budget expectations therefore revolve around the theme of identifying these systemic deficiencies and how government can now try and weed off these systemic deficiencies in the economy. And therefore our expectations are much about the government to focus, or rather refocus, into areas which were once a reason to celebrate and may just now become the reasons again to revitalize the economy. These are refocusing on MSMEs, refocusing on SEZs, and refocusing on R&D for greater innovation. On the first aspect relating to refocusing on MSMEs, now the part of the reason why this has become much a reason to focus is the recent PLI schemes. Now, if we focus, there was around 3 trillion of a budget outlay which was meant largely for large corporates such as the champions as the policies identified them, leaving out a vast majority of MSMEs in the lurch. Now, one may be surprised to note that of the 15 schemes, there were only 2 schemes which specifically carried out a chapter for MSMEs. And of the 3 trillion that I've been saying again and again, it was just 10 billion earmarked for MSMEs. Therefore, one of the major contributors to the economies, the MSMEs, were left out in this race for PLIs. Another feature of MSMEs is the recent increase in their exemption limits. The last change was carried out in June 2020. And at that time, the government also introduced the Udyam registration portal. One may again be surprised to note that then there were around 6.3 crores of MSME entities which had to apply onto the Udyam registration portal. As late as December 21, only a meager 10% of those MSME entities have registered onto the Udyam registration portal. This only puts a focus on why entities are reluctant to now apply on the MSME portal. One is the exemption limits would have been surpassed, and the second, the benefits per se are not reaching out to these entities. And therefore, it becomes time for the government to now focus on whether it should bring out specific policies similar to the PLI schemes for MSMEs, as also raise the exemption limits for MSMEs. It's also time for government to ponder as to why a separate ministry is looking at startups when essentially it's the same corporate entities doing manufacturing and services, which could either be a startup or a MSME. So it's time that the government realign its 2 different legislations meant for the same purpose. The second area for refocus is the SEZs. Now, after the sunset clause set in for SEZs, there's not been much of an interest generated by units to register themselves for SEZs. In fact, quite the contrary. Many units are wanting to denotify themselves from the areas notified as SEZ. And the contributory reason for this is the fact that when there is a sale from a SEZ onto a DTA unit, it's treated at par with how an import is treated for a unit operating in the DTA. Now, with the PMPs coming in, which is the phased manufacturing program, which is introduced by various ministries from electronics to most of the ministries, the fact is you would have a steady gradual increase of import tariffs laid out for a simple sale between a SEZ and a DTA, which is quite contrary to the to the reason why SEZs were set up, which is to promote sale from such SEZs. Now, there have been far too many industry representations laid out to address this issue. It's yet to see light of the day. Another peculiar feature of SEZs has been to promote exports and thereby incentivize the unit on not just the indirect tax side but also the direct tax side. That's been missing out, and partially that's one area where the government could just immediately plug in the lacuna which is left out by the selected few PLI applicants. So instead of making the PLI scheme available to a select few, they can broad base the SEZ units and thereby have a larger base to support. The third area of focus here is the focus on R&D units. Now, the Prime Minister was kind enough to lay out 16 January as the startup day for innovation. Fundamentally, today's startups are coming out in all genres, but on one side, when we have a Atmanirbhar scheme which is more focused on Make in India or manufacturing in India, what is missing out is the entrepreneur's zeal or the vision to have a R&D objective for the company. It's only in this light that if you were to introduce the weighted aggregate scheme which was almost like 200% reduction on the in-house R&D expenditure carried out by corporates, is where greater synergies will come in from a startup, innovation and R&D base. Put to this the greater requirement for a pharmaceutical industry, it becomes even more stronger a case